Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I hope you all had an enjoyable Thanksgiving weekend, whether that was last weekend or a dozen weeks ago. Now last week I talked a little bit about what I call the pillars of fantasy. These are the big structural advantages to telling a story set in an entirely made-up world. And while I think those are interesting ideas to think about, and certainly something that I think about when I'm deciding whether I want to tell a fantasy story or something else, like perhaps a science fiction story, the pillars of fantasy do not alone define a story. I wanted to talk a little bit more about what I'm hoping to do with the novella Burning Bright that I am currently working on, and why I chose to write it as a fantasy story. And part of what I want to do, of course, is just tell a really fun, entertaining story, and a story that I have had in my mind for quite some time. But I'm also interested in examining the idea of how you tell a story to a very media-savvy society. What do I mean by that? Well, one of the most influential storytellers of the 20th century was George Lucas, and he drew a lot of his ideas from Joseph Campbell, who wrote the book The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And to summarize the ideas there, Campbell believed in a thing he called the monomyth, a story that we tell ourselves over and over again because it is of great psychological or societal significance. This is the story of the great hero, of the great savior, of the Messiah, and there's a lot of truth to Campbell's analysis. Lots of people have studied his work and that of George Lucas in an attempt to tell better stories. They have boiled down this monomyth and many other characters who appear in a great number of stories into a writing tool referred to as archetypes. Archetypes are very useful. They have a lot of purposes in analyzing and in constructing a work of fiction. The problem is, as an audience becomes very familiar with archetypes, both audience and writer can become lazy and over-reliant on them. They can simply create something that fills an archetype and trust that the audience will fill in the blanks for them. They don't have to work a whole lot to set up this character, their motivations, the little details that change a character into a person. And as archetypes have taken over more and more of our storytelling, I think we have gotten fewer and fewer characters who come across as people. This is to the detriment of storytelling. At least I certainly think so. So I've set out to tell some stories that examine archetypical characters who are also people. I want to tell stories that look a little bit outside the archetype to bring that sense of humanity back into them. I don't think that this loss of realism, this loss of humanity in these archetypical characters is a direct result of conforming to an archetype or trying to look at a heroic character or a tragic character. I think it's a result of laziness on the part of authors, and I want to try and put some of that work in that will make characters that are part of an archetype still unique and distinct personalities again. I want to shake up the confines of the archetype, not because the archetype itself is bad, but because we have gotten so comfortable with it, we are no longer looking at it in new ways. Burning Bright is my first attempt to tell a story of a chosen one that is different, not because it subverts the chosen one archetype or because the chosen one archetype is somehow a method of controlling the population like your typical postmodernist will tell you, but because I want to appreciate what it means to fill this kind of heroic role as a person and not simply as an agent of fate or as a part of a plot. And to do that, I want to look at the chosen one from a whole bunch of different angles beyond what we normally see it as. Typically, the chosen one story is told as a coming-of-age story from the receiving or just before the receiving of a great task until the completion of that task. And in this story, Burning Bright is looking at the story of a chosen one whose task is now complete, but who still feels burdened to do good things in the world. And I want to examine that and ask questions about it and present the complexities of that in a way that will fascinate the reader and present us with a heroic character who is in a world that is not necessarily neat or simple, but still allows for a character to behave in a morally upstanding way. This is not a grimdark world, but it is a little more complicated than your archetypical world that we see in a lot of fantasy, say, video games or even young adult novels. My hope is that if this story receives a good reception, I will be able to go on and look at the archetype from other angles, such as what if the Chosen One is actually somewhat old when he receives his calling? Or what if he is never acknowledged by the world at large as a Chosen One? Does he still have some part to play? These are interesting questions that allow us to take an archetype and examine it in a new context and see that maybe it still has something to tell us. And maybe the people who inhabit it can be a little more surprising to us than the stock archetype can be right now in this very media-savvy culture we live in. That is what I am trying to do with Burning Bright and hopefully any other stories that follow in its footsteps. Let me emphasize again, I am not doing this because I think that archetypes are bad. I don't think our culture being very media savvy is bad. It just means you have to work a little bit harder and you have to be willing to go a little further out of your way to look at things to tell a really good story. Now, archetypes do exist as sort of boundaries that define where a tried and true set of good storytelling principles has already been laid out. There is a danger in going out beyond those boundaries, and I could very well find myself in trouble as I try and tell these stories. But that is, at least for me, the author, part of the adventure of trying to tell these kinds of stories. And I hope that for you, the audience, you will enjoy this as well, even though we might not necessarily wind up where we wanted to. Anyway, that's all I've got for you today. There's a like button and a subscribe button down below you can use as you see fit. Let me know what you think of going outside the bounds of storytelling down in the comments below, and I'll talk to you later.